Good evening, good morning, wherever you find yourself. My name is Tara Needham. I am the Assistant Academic Director at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College in the Hudson Valley of New York State. If you are zooming in from afar and abroad, we are so thrilled to see so many people logging on and logging in for this very important conversation about debt and finance capital. We're also thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event with the Museum of Care and with the Economic Democracy Initiative at Bard College. You know, when we were approached by Nika Dubrovsky, we felt there was a real resonance between what she described as the mission of the Museum of Care, which whose projects aim to create a public space to discuss what Dostoevsky called the cursed questions. What is power? What is freedom, value, and so on? The Hannah Arendt Center similarly promotes bold and risky thinking in the spirit of Arendt and aims to create forums for the debate of ideas on pressing topics of our time. There's no doubt that debt and finance capital are such issues that have immense bearing on topics that were of great concern for Arendt: democracy, freedom, the possibility for spontaneity, and political action. That said, our participation is not to suggest that Arendt herself would have, or that the center necessarily agrees with or endorses all the views of the panelists. Rather, our goal is, again, to invite and foster lively debate, and we hope that participants will respectfully challenge, question, and clarify the points of view presented tonight. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Niko Dabrofsky, who is an artist and an author who grew up in the unofficial cultural scenes of squats in Samizdat of the late USSR. She's written for many publications and exhibited at, among others, the Tel Aviv Museum, Galleria Nova Zagreb, Showroom London, Fabrica Moscow, and Apex Art New York. She works on several publishing and artistic projects, including Yes Women Group, art activist feminist community, and others. After her husband David Graeber's death, Nika and friends organized Carnival for David, which took place in 250 places around the world. Carnival for David evolved into the informal community of the Museum of Care, which is creating projects like the one tonight at the intersection of academia, activism, and contemporary art. So welcome to Nika, our panelists, and everyone participating.
So thank you very much for hosting this event. And yeah, the first of the Fight Club between Michael Hudson and Thomas Piketty was held on the 10th anniversary of the edition of David Graeber's book, 5,000 Years of Debt. I want to say that a lot has changed for the better since then. The public discourse has shifted. Now many people recognize debt for what it is, structural violence. Second, the abstract debt was created, and I'm especially happy that Astra Taylor is with us today. Astra is not only shares the ideas of David, Michael Hudson, and Steve King that all debts should be abolished, but abstract debt is successfully buying out unfair debts, for example, student medical debts, acting essentially in the same way as abolitionists did, freeing people from debt slavery. And I want to encourage everyone who watches today to help them. I would like to announce our next Fight Club that will be at Hauskultur der Welt in Berlin this spring, with actors and activists, David's friends, to perform an imaginary fight between David Graeber and Thomas Hobbes, and David Graeber versus Jean-Jacques Rousseau, starring Jacques Servine of the Yes Men, Reverend Billy, and Savitri G of the Church of Stop Shopping. This fight is a major point that was explored in David's last book, Dawn of Everything, that he co-wrote with an archaeologist, David Van Groo. In the first Fight Club, the fight had so many rounds that we didn't have time to answer questions from the public. So in the spirit of the boxing match, we are going to have our combank, Michael Hudson, conduct a post-match debrief where the public can ask questions and get answers. So meet Steve King, Michael Hudson, Pavlina Tcherneva, and Astra Taylor.
What do you think? We have a problem. Let's solve it together. The game is on.
Okay, everyone. My name is Astra Taylor. Can you guys see me or? Okay, great. My name is Astra Taylor. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Nika. And I just want to reiterate thanking our hosts, the Hannah Arendt Center and the Museum of Care. Thanks for having us. And I watched the first Fight Club with great interest, noting the paradox between the terms care and fighting. So this will be a loving debate with a lot of, I think, agreement among the participants. But one thing I will say is as an activist and organizer working very hard on the issues of debt cancellation, I am constantly encountering critics and criticism. So I will do my best maybe to channel some of the contrarianism that I face when I share these ideas. So my name is Astra Taylor. I'll be quick, but just to set the stage, my friend, the late and great David Graeber, sort of recruited me into what became a kind of debt resistance movement. He actually invited me to the planning sessions of Occupy Wall Street. So this was back in 2011. And I was at that point a recently defaulted student debtor and, understood that my condition was political, but didn't have any people to share that sense with. Certainly didn't have the sense that the wider world, shared my sense of injustice. And out of the ashes of Occupy Wall Street, we started organizing around debt based on the recognition that a lot of people who came to Occupy were in debt for education, for healthcare. Of course, it was the mortgage crisis that it was the larger framework. So debt was everywhere once you started looking at it. And since then, David eventually went to the UK. I kept organizing with people and we launched something called the Debt Collective, which is a union for debtors. And we have been organizing primarily around the issue of student debt cancellation, though we also work on other types of debt. For example, some of our co-founders planned the first protest demanding full student debt cancellation and free public college in 2012, marking one T-Day, the day student debt surpassed $1 trillion. It's now 1.8 trillion. So math, in terms of pure math, things have gotten a lot worse. But as Nika said rightly, the discourse is much better. And partly because of the Debt Collective, we've unearthed the various legal mechanisms by which it is actually very possible for the government to cancel student debt. And we have forced them to cancel upwards of $10 billion of student debt just in 2021 alone. So debt cancellation we've proven it's a realistic demand. It's a very popular one. I just saw an ad for Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor of Georgia, and she talks about medical debt cancellation in her campaign ad. So I think that's another sign of the times. So I think, I won't delay us, but we are definitely in a moment where I think the question is, how can we keep expanding the public imagination on this issue? How can we address some of the doubts people have, because not everybody agrees? And then, strategically, what do we do? Where is the power? And we have great panels here to talk about these issues and to address some of the common concerns. People are worried about the deficit, right? Worried about the way that this will affect. There's a lot of misapprehensions about how personal debt and public debt relates. Hopefully we can set some of those straight here. Some of the questions that we can return to according to the materials circulated in advance. Should student debt be canceled? I already answered that, yes, and it can be. Can the government run out of money? What is money? What is debt? So if people, I want to invite people to touch on those points, since that's what the audience was told they'd hear about. I also want to invite people to use the Q&A function that is here. We're going to also address some of the questions from the last session, as Nika said, that didn't get answered. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, the esteemed Michael Hudson, who has been working on the question of Jubilee for a long time and really is in many ways inspiration for David's work, for the Debt Collective's work, really blazed an incredible trail talking about the history and precedents and philosophy of Jubilee and more. Michael Hudson is president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends, a Wall Street financial analyst, distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is the author of And Forgive Them Their Debts, 2018, and J is for Junk Economics, and I assume there are many other books. Steve Keen is an Australian economist and author. He's the author of Debunking Economics, and more recently, The New Economics, a Manifesto. Pavlina Tcherneva is an associate professor of economics at Bard College and a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute. She specializes in modern monetary theory and public policy. So a warm welcome to all of you. And I'm going to pass it over to Steve Keen to offer some thoughts on the last Fight Club session and maybe give us some brief thoughts on debt. What is it? Why should it go?
Okay, my sound is coming through? Good, all right, okay. I'll start first of all with a thank you to Thomas Piketty, who couldn't join us for this session. It is very rare for mainstream economists to engage with critics like myself and Michael and Pavlina. So it's a tribute to him that he was very generous with his time. And I thought also he was very generous with his perspective in the debate. If I can characterize how Thomas would differ from myself and Michael, Thomas's recommendations at the end of his magnum opus Capital were fundamentally tax the rich. And the attitude which Michael and myself have concerning debt is abolish the debt. Now, of course, if you think about what tax is and what interest payments are and what profit are, they're all flows. They're flows of money per year. That's how they're denominated. And what taxation says is, well, let's take some of that flow away from the rich and direct it to the poor. That is the conventional attitude towards taxation. And I'm sure Pavlina will get in here and elaborate that tax doesn't actually pay for anything. When you take a look at the modern monetary theory perspective on how government money is created, the government creates money by running a deficit. So government spending creates money, taxation destroys money, and it doesn't actually contribute to anything. It's the government, as one of the two primary money creators in a capitalist economy, can create the money it needs for any particular task. It doesn't need to tax. So what then is the perspective on tax from this position? It is fundamentally that taxation decides whose bank account goes down to reduce the excess money created by government spending. And what we know from the last 30 years or so is that the rich are incredibly successful at making sure it's not their accounts that get affected. So what we'd be doing with taxation isn't doing what is the perspective from Piketty's Capital in the first place. And secondly, the rich are very, very good at evading it. Now, the point from Michael, and I'm sure Michael will elaborate very effectively here on his own behalf, but what we see, and this comes out of my own mathematical modeling, I might add, is that debt increases the income of the rich, which is quite obvious. It increases the income of what we would call rentiers. But it actually, in my mathematical modeling of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, it actually directly reduces the income share of the workers. In my simple models, which I explain in the recent manifesto, the debt is money is in that model modeled exclusively by the firm. That's a simplification I make to start the model. And I did not expect this outcome. But what happened was the profit rate that capitalists got, the owners of the firm, varied around an equilibrium level. As the level of private debt went up, the level of income going to workers went down. It was a direct relationship. And I explained the causal mechanism in manifesto. I won't try to elaborate here. So fundamentally, reducing the debt will increase the share of income going to workers. And on top of that, we have the modern monetary theory case that the government doesn't need to borrow in order to spend, doesn't need to tax to finance it. So all the things like student debt are a travesty when you intellectually understand how money is created. I'll hand back to the other panelists. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. I want to hand it to Pavlina to give her perspective on debt. And, I wouldn't, modern monetary theory is really useful in this, but, one thing we encounter over and over again is this assumption people have, and it's because it's part of right-wing ideology in their frame, that, the state is like a household. They can run out of money, you got to tighten your belt and budget in this limited way. So maybe, I think, commenting on that, if you're inspired to, would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I want to start with actually David Graeber's comment on paradoxes that we have in our daily lives, how we have turned like absurdities into like common sense, what people perceive to be as common sense. And this idea that the government must behave as a household, and especially when it comes to its financial affairs, is one of those paradoxes that we have created such mythology and just culture of acceptance of this basically flawed idea. And it's all built on a completely flawed understanding of money, on the history of money, on the origins of money. And I will not go through all of it now, but just to say that even on the face of it, when we consider a very basic, simple reality that the currency in our pockets comes from one place and one place alone, and that comes from the public sector. Just when we consider that basic stylized fact, it can't possibly be true that the government needs to get money from us to pay for its expenses when it has the ultimate means, it issues the ultimate means, final means of payment. So MMT really zeroes in on that under-theorized aspect of the monetary reality. There is private debt, there is private money creation at all levels. We use this hierarchical model to describe it, but the public currency is under-theorized. And so governments have had this prerogative to issue their currencies, and even in the old days to stamp their gold coins. They have had this prerogative, and they must first provide the currency before they can retrieve it back in the form of tax payments or bond sales. And so what MMT basically stresses is that the causality is completely upside down. It's reversed. The issuer must provide the currency before the users can use it to pay taxes, to purchase government securities. So a fundamental contribution from an MMT point of view is that government is self-financed, but you must also look at the kind of government you're talking about. We have so adopted these mythologies that governments must behave like households that we have created these monetary systems and these monetary regimes which artificially constrain this very basic prerogative of government. And then we force the public sector to behave like a household, to tax in order to pay. So, countries that give up their own currencies, that dollarize, that accept, or that actually inherit colonial currencies, they are fundamentally constrained in many ways in managing their domestic economic affairs. So the public sector, we need to be looking at what kind of monetary regime we're looking at, what kind of institutional design we have, what kind of coordination we have between our institutions to meet our economic objectives. So lesson number 2 from MMT is that zeroing in on these arbitrary ratios, debt to deficit, debt to GDP, deficit to GDP ratio, these are really red herrings. They divert our attention from the important issues. How does the government spend? On what does it spend? What kind of policies do we as democratic polity demand of the government? And have we surrendered them to this false ideology that the government does not have money and that it must pinch its pennies like a household? I'll just pause here and we can carry this further.
Yeah, so much to dig into, but Michael, would you like to weigh in, respond to these comments, and maybe say anything you didn't get to say in the last session before we go deeper?
Pavlina is quite right when she says that public debt is not the problem. Private debt is the problem. So I want to pick up what Steve Keen said, because he was addressing the issue that kept coming up in the debate. And what was the argument with Piketty? Piketty wanted to tax wealth to make people more equal. The problem is the taxes leave the existing economic structure in place. So if you taxed the banks, the debts would still mount up. You'd still have student debt. You'd still have foreclosures. You'd still have insolvency. But the rich would have to pay some of the cost of impoverishing society to the government, which doesn't really need it anyway. So I don't think that taxes address the problem that Steve and I are talking about, that the economy has a real structural problem. And from what David Graeber and I talked about for years, debt is what the 99% owe to the 1%. Most people are in debt, and most debts are owed to 1% of the population. And paying this debt leaves less disposable income for the debtors, less for students, because if they pay student debt, they can't afford to buy a mortgage, to buy a home. Homeowners have to pay mortgage debt and can't afford to buy goods and services. Credit card companies, auto loans. Most of the people who wanted to disagree with what Steve and I are saying about the need to cancel this debt that is bankrupting the economy is, well, isn't debt a choice? It's a voluntary bargain between borrowers and debtors. Why do you want to interfere with the free market and the voluntary bargain? Well, the bargain is your money or your life. You want a home or you want to be sleep in the sidewalk? Oh, you want a home? You got to go into debt. Do you want a job? Well, you're going to have to get a degree. Get a degree, you're going to have to go into debt unless your parents were bankers or had enough money to put you through. So most debts throughout most of history weren't voluntary. They were arrears. They were cultivators on the land. That there was a crop failure. There was a war. They couldn't pay the debts. Most debts were just regular income that couldn't be paid. And the creditors use the misfortune of society, like the COVID crisis, as an opportunity to make money. And you can see that here in New York, where we all are. Right now, there are a lot of people that have lost their jobs. A lot of people, these people either are renters and can't pay the rent, or if they bought a home, they can't pay the mortgage. There was a moratorium. Biden said, well, we can't just throw all these people out on the street. Let's have a moratorium. It expires in February. In February, tens of thousands of New Yorkers are going to be evicted, thrown onto the street, and their houses are going to be put up for sale. And there are a lot of investment companies just waiting to pick up all of these houses. So what Steve and I are talking about is debt is not in equilibrium. Debt grows exponentially, and it ends up engulfing the whole economy. And that's why you get to choose. Do you want to keep the debts in place and let the economy polarize and shrink? Or do you want to write down the savings of the 1% that are invested in loans to the 99%?
Yeah, well said. One phrase from the Debt Collective to get at this point, they're making your money or your life is, we're not in debt because we live beyond our means, but because we're denied the means to live. And so I think I'm sure people here, everybody agrees that debt abolition and debt jubilee is coupled with social provisions, right? Pavlina's written about jobs guarantee, right? I mean, the thing is, this was the old idea of a jubilee too, debt cancellation plus you get land back, or, the means of survival. But you're making the really important point, which is, people are basically, and this is stuff we just see at the Debt Collective every day in the debtors we speak to, who are desperate, sometimes suicidal. This is such an urgent issue for so many people. Debt, makes people poorer, but it also, makes people sicker. And there's a lot of evidence to back that up. But people are robbed twice, right? They're underpaid at the job and then forced to borrow to survive. And this is definitely a means of wealth extraction. It makes the rich richer, the poor poorer. Another way to put this is that debt isn't just about money, it's about power. And you all have hit on that. Do people want to say, anyone feel inspired to take that up, right? I mean, this is, why do we have this system? Why does it stay? If we can point out all the ways it's seemingly irrational, unfair, why is it so entrenched? And that's because this is power. It's not just a way to get money. It also keeps people under the thumb of creditors. And David Graeber was, or not just of creditors, but of employers. Do people want to speak to that at all? the way debt obstructs democracy, keeps people down.
Well, it wasn't supposed to be that way. With power. Debt was the first debts anthropologically were the vergeld debts. If you were in a primitive society and you injured somebody, you have to pay reparations. You have a choice. If you beat somebody up, break his arm, or kill someone, either your family would feud with them and you'd all begin fighting, or you'd pay reparations. The whole idea of debt, the whole economy functioned on credit. Long before there was money, there was credit. If you were a farmer in Mesopotamia in 3000 BC, you get the what do you do during the crop year? Money was used one day a year for the farmers in Mesopotamia. That's when the harvest time came in. And the debts that they owed for the beer that they drank at the local ale house, and we have the records of the ale house, and for the food or for the horses or for the water. When you go to the ale house, you'd run up a bill, a tab, just like today. And it all came due at harvest time and everything would be paid. And that worked, except once in a while, there was a crop failure or there was a drought. And Hammurabi would say, if the people can't pay the debt, we're going to cancel it, because if they can't pay the debt and they become a slave of the ale lady, do we really want the cultivators all to end up the debt servants in bondage, owing their crops to the ale lady? And then we're not going to be able to get them to work on the corvée work to build palace walls and temples and dig ditches, and we're not going to be able to get the crop taxes from them. So the whole idea, debt was supposed to be in equilibrium, and when it couldn't be paid, every early society wiped them out. And all of that occurred until Greece and Rome. It was really Rome that made debt a means of getting labor into debt and having to work off the debt on the land of the creditor. And we're still living with the backwash of Roman law. And that's the problem. Our legal system is pro-creditor, and this went against every society that preceded Rome, and that's become the legal system of Western civilization.
Yep, really interesting. Yeah, Pavlina, you want to weigh in?
I love where Michael took this conversation. When we look at Graeber's book, debt is a social relationship, and it became monetized through time. But even early on, there was this kind of coercive relationship between authority, palace, king, and subjects, and that was the tax. That's a debt. That's a sort of debt. And that tax was always there to compel, to force the production of goods and resources to provision the palace. Okay, this is unavoidable. And that tax was used to eventually, kind of standardize the unit of account, how we pay these debts. And Michael's work is very good in illustrating that when private creditors gained so much power over credit creation, then the peasants were obligated to the private creditors. And they were not as obligated to the state in terms of delivering corn and barley and grain to the palace. So the palace actually, that weakened the palace capability to do debt jubilees, because the palace could say, I forgive you your debts. If you had a crop failure, you don't have to deliver the grain to me. But the private creditor would not do that. Now, why does the palace tax? Because the palace not only needed to provision for itself and gain the riches, it's all power. But also they did build, corvée labor was infrastructure. It was public work. So there was some semblance of kind of public goods provisioning, however coercive that was. That is very much, fast forward to the present day, that is very much the function of the tax today. The public sector, which issues its own currency, does not need to tax to collect the tax to finance its public projects. The function of the tax is still for the public to require the public's currency to work in exchange to provision goods and services. And it is, one might argue in a democratic sense, our expectation of the state is then to provide public goods that will provision for the community as a whole. Now, what does this have to do with student debt? Well, I mean, student debt is one of those debts that actually can be forgiven. That the vast majority of student debt is held by the public sector. There is a small proportion that is held by private, privately issued debt and not backed by government guarantees. But as we have shown at the Levy Institute, it is without major disruptions, in fact, to the private sector, which you probably want to create disruptions, you can cancel it. You can have a debt jubilee with student debt. And so I think that broadly, I would think about taxes in this way, that they are, certainly historically a coercive mechanism. They are certainly a force that compels us to work in exchange for money. And now we have had, various campaigns about, taxation without representation, which presupposes certain democratic demand, right? That we want the collective to do something for all of us. But we need to kind of connect that to theorizing what the money can do, what the public sector with the public currency can do. If it is going to tax, and if it's going to attract resources, then it has a reciprocal obligation to then, quote unquote, provide for the good life. And this whole mythology that we can't cancel the debts, that somehow it's inequitable for the rich kids to have their debt canceled, along with many other things, are just disempowering narratives that we can do X, Y, and Z.
Can I elaborate something that what Pavlina just said? She pointed to the key point that the reason that student debt can be canceled is it's owed to the government, not private banks. So there's no lobbying organization that's going to come in and say you can't interfere with private enterprise. But earlier she said that the debt was the power of the ruler over the debtors. The people that the rulers of Mesopotamia really wanted power over was debt over the creditors. Every early society stabilized itself by preventing the emergence of a creditor oligarchy. And over and over again, you'd see creditors getting rich, then all of a sudden they would disappear from the record. The idea is that all the way down through the Byzantine Empire, the rulers would say, we don't want a wealthy creditor oligarchy because they're going to use this labor as an army and they're going to overthrow us. And then they're going to write all the laws and then we won't get any more taxes. They'll get all of the money and they'll be the new kings. So look at China, for instance. China is in the position of its economy as the US is to the student debtors. It's easy to write down the debts if the debts are owed to yourself. That's why the Mesopotamians were able to write down the debts. It's because they were all owed to the palace and the temples. And they also would make sure that the debts to the private creditors were canceled and they'd move against the creditors. So the key in preserving democracy was to have what President Biden calls an autocracy. An autocracy is someone who says the public interest is more important than the interest of creditors.
I think this really, for me, coming from the debt collective, there's a lot of really interesting strategic questions here, because that is why we focused on student debt, precisely for this reason, because we know the majority, as you say, is held by the federal government. Nevertheless, the government was pretending it didn't have the power to cancel it. So we had to throw that in its face multiple times and, have made headway there. And if there are leverage points against private creditors, it's that they're violating laws, consumer protection laws, that they're engaging in robo-signing or shenanigans, but we do have less leverage. And I think there's some major strategic challenges that are being raised here. Steve, would you like to come in and maybe, I don't know, the standard, response to some of this talk is, but we need the creditors. They're productively investing capital. And if debts are abolished, won't they go on strike and not, lend to people? Yeah, I mean, the important point, I think I like the way that we were taken with Pavlina as well, to talking about where this originated, because we go right back, and I haven't yet read, I must admit, David Graeber's latest and last book. That's my reading on my flight to Australia on Friday. But if you look at where we all began, humans built societies built on mutual obligation, and we'd actually do things for each other. It was actually fundamentally a gift-based society was the really ancient basis of how humans behaved towards each other.
And that has been perverted over time into what we now call debt. It first of all went through the Mesopotamian systems where Michael explained the role very well. Now it's been taken over by the private sector. And what we have is, I divide the world into three major social classes: workers, capitalists, and bankers. And what has happened is the bankers are the ones, the financial sector, are the ones who've completely distorted that original role of the thing which makes us a human society, and now made it into a form of bondage for part of that society. But the trouble is that bondage is disguised by economic theory. And if you have any exposure to neoclassical economics, you would know of things like what's called the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis, that says that it's actually ultimately, if you pay any tax at all, it's better that a corporation be 100% financed by debt. You get the argument that the government has to borrow off the public, which really treats money as being something like, as my good friend Michael Hudson, the only neoclassical economist who understands money, says that it treats money like gravel that has to be dug up and dumped in some person's storage system and then doled out when necessary. It's like the physical thing rather than a sense of obligation designed either between the public and the government, or the public and the private banking sector. So once if we realize that that we have two major institutions to create money, governments spending more than they get back in taxation, or banks lending out more than they get back in repayments. The question is, for what ends of those is that money used? When we take a look at the private sector, the financial sector has used economic theory, without knowing they're doing it, but used economic theory as a cover to finance asset price inflation and to put us in debt, into bondage for the remainder of it. It is not a creative use of money at all. Banks, after the Great Depression, which was the last time we had a serious debt crisis that then led through dramatic transformations of society, bankers were a despised class in the beginning of the 40s and 50s, and they were controlled. Their role was to provide investment finance for industrial capital. That back in those days, the level of private debt, the non-financial sector's private debt was roughly 40% of GDP, and most of that was corporate debt. If you fast forward to the financial crisis, that rose to 170% of GDP, and it was predominantly household debt. And a large part of that household debt was actually what gave us the bubble in house prices in the first place. You had a negative, a damaging feedback relationship between debt, asset prices, and ultimately a financial collapse. So we need to have a decent theory, and MMT is part of that theory. The other part is Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. They are quite compatible with each other. And what they tell us is we should reduce the level of private debt. And if you do that, rather than taking money away from the poor rich as well, what you do is give more money to workers who spend more. So you actually get, when I've modeled a modern debt jubilee, you get a boost in economic activity and ultimately even the capitalists benefit. So this is one of those terrible cases where ideology leads us into a trap that makes everybody off, but puts some people in power over the poor.
Yes, really interesting comments. I'm here scanning some of the questions from the last Fight Club, and we have actually answered a couple of them. I mean, one, you just used the word stabilizing. One person asked, wouldn't canceling debts be destabilizing? And you're actually saying the opposite, which I think the research shows, which it actually would be good for capitalism in a kind of idealized version of it, where it actually wants to share prosperity. Yeah, Michael, pointing your finger.
The good thing about canceling the debt and why it's stable is you cancel savings on the other side of the balance sheet. We're talking about debt, but all this debt is somebody else's savings. And the problem is that almost all the savings in the economy are now owned by the 1%. That's why David popularized the concept of 1%. And the best thing you can do, if you cancel the debt to the 1%, you wipe out their savings and you take away their dominance, just like the 19th century finally took away the power of landlords that they had since feudal times. And that was what triggered the takeoff of industrial capitalism. You have to cancel this rentier claims on society that the creditor doesn't really play a productive role. He collects interest in his sleep, just like the landlord collects interest in his sleep. Landlords, creditors, rentiers, monopolists, they do not play a productive role. So what do you destabilize? You destabilize the destabilizer.
Pavlina, did you have a thought? Yes.
If I can come back. Okay, after you. Sorry, Pavlina.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'll go then.
So yeah. Okay, finish, Steve, and I'll step in.
Sorry. Okay. If we did that, I mean, that is the ideal. Let's get rid of the power structure. But of course, the power structure's got the power, so we would lose that battle inevitably. So the proposal I've been putting forward, which actually uses the concept of MMT as well, is a modern debt jubilee, and that says, look, there are two ways you can create money. The government can spend more than it gets back in taxes. The private bank can lend more than they get back in repayments. Now, if you use the government's power, you could actually give everybody an equal amount of money and say, if you have any debt, you must cancel that debt. So you create money, which means that for the creditor class, what they have is their loans disappear, but they get money in a bank account instead. Okay, they get reserves fundamentally. So they don't actually end up losing out. But what it does is, by giving everybody the same amount of money, you give far more to the workers than you give to the capitalists and rentiers. And by that mechanism, you actually end up stimulating the economy. You can even set it up so that the bonds, interest paid on the bonds by the government takes the place of interest paid on debt by the private sector. And the rentiers end up coming out getting the sort of money that used to mean the role of banking was described as I think the numbers are 3, 6, and 3. Borrow at 3, charge at 6, and be on the golf course by 3 p.m. Now that's where they bloody well belong. They don't belong running Washington in what I now call the financial politico complex. Get them back on the golf course where their uselessness can be put to something productive.
Well, Steve, your proposal to bail out the billionaires is very good for you billionaires sitting there. But the fact is, do you really want to leave these billionaires with all the money? This debate came up with the Civil War. When you wanted to get rid of slavery, people said, well, if Abraham Lincoln cancels slavery, he has to pay the slave owners. And Lincoln said, absolutely not. Slave owning is wrong, and we're not going to create a new wealthy class to dominate the country by paying them for all the money that they've got from slaves. You don't want to bail out to make the creditors whole. Come on, I don't have $1 billion like you, but I certainly would not want to bail out these bastards.
All right.
I'll pass on that for some questions.
So Pavlina, I want you to respond to this, but I also want to throw you one more question from the last session that I think, and this person asked, the main result of quantitative easing appeared to be an increase in the value of assets such as share prices and housing. I'm assuming they're talking about, early 2020 when COVID hit, when the government bought a lot of bad corporate debt. Steve mentioned corporate debt. So the person asked, to what extent are the central banks captured by the interests of the richest in society, and what should be done about this?
Okay, so that's exactly where I was going to go with this conversation. I mean, debt jubilees happen all the time. What did we do in 2008? The government stepped in with extraordinary budget and purchased enormous amount of toxic financial assets. I don't know what else we can call a debt jubilee if not, making these assets whole. So it's a type of debt jubilee. What did we do during COVID? We paused the economy. Governments appropriated again budgets that they had not appropriated in post-war history in any crisis. Japan, I think, passed 56% of GDP a budget overnight. The United States, 27%. That has to concentrate the mind. The government has all the financial resources that it needs to grease the economic wheels, to pause student debt, to pause moratorium on mortgage payments. So it's just a matter of choices. I would say that the tax system obviously doesn't do this. What we want to do is simply eliminate extractive services, right? We want to eliminate kind of unproductive, predatory practices, unsustainable practices. I think that there is a way to certainly, pacify the rentier class by replacing private debts with public debts, because those are default risk-free. And that's what we do all the time. And so I think for the debt collective, this is an argument to say you have a public purse that is regularly used for these kinds of purposes to forgive debts of the private sector. We can certainly deploy it for student debts. And so the question here is, the state, the government creates the only default risk-free asset. That's the only one that can do this. Europe is grappling with this. They have designed a system that they cannot create a default risk-free bond, and they changed and broke their own rules during the pandemic to make sure that the European Central Bank actually purchases these government bonds to make sure that the bills are paid and there's no question asked. That is the monetary reality. And we just work around it to kind of limit our policy space. So QE, what was QE? I mean, QE was a way of basically, ensuring the positive value of something that is essentially worthless. Some insurance on some, derivative that, the financial sector created just to create financial return, financial profits. There's no productive, value to this kind of activity. We are essentially validating the financialization of the economy through QE in order to prevent some sort of financial global collapse. Could we have done it differently? Of course, we could have made companies whole. We could have made households whole. We could have made big industrial, firms whole. We didn't have to necessarily to rescue the financial sector, which is the way we went about this. And so I don't quite believe that the QE is what fed an asset bubble. It definitely supported values of assets that had no value. The market suddenly realized these are not worth anything. And so we supported those assets. It's that we permit the financial sector to do what it does that feeds this financial bubble. Like we don't have the regulations. I don't think interest rates are going to do the job, or stopping QE will stop this kind of speculative behavior. So is the banking sector captured? In many ways. And one of the most important ways is ideology. Is this belief, this deep belief that somehow we have to manage our economic affairs through this construction, the private market, rather than acknowledge the powers that we have in our public institutions and deploy them.
I mean, but part of the appeal of bond financing things isn't just that, rich investors get their payments, but that it's a way of circumventing democratic deliberation too, right? That's part of the benefits. Like, oh, well, sorry, we have to pay back the bondholders, so democracy goes out the window, right? So there's all these value added for the 1%.
Even that is such a mythology. Like, what is a bondholder? The bondholder is not financing the government. The government is providing the bondholder an opportunity to earn interest. So it's completely upside down.
It's a gift, not a necessity.
That's right. We don't need to have, I like to have treasuries in my retirement portfolio. Okay. It's the default risk-free asset, but it's not for pacifying the bondholders that we need to be doing all this.
So I'm just trying to bring in the questions from the Q&A, which there's a lot of great stuff. But Nicole Brummer said the bailouts in the crisis were like a Jubilee, but only for the rich 1%. So we're saying, yes, indeed, we could call these a kind of Jubilee. How to make sure the Jubilee isn't stolen by the rich? Well, my sense is we haven't figured that out because we don't have enough counterpower. Debtors aren't organized, creditors are. There's all this ideology we have to debunk, but curious if other people have some thoughts about that moving forward. So the next emergency isn't as profitable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And that comes back to the power structure talk that Michael and I were having a difference of opinion of over there. Because at the moment, the power is entirely vested with the creditors, and they dominate how the government thinks as well. We need to break that nexus. I would rather break it by a way that actually shuts them up by stuffing money in their mouth, which is what they seem to prefer to do, rather than trying to decapitate them. Because I've got a feeling that at the moment, they have a more powerful way of arguing than I have. I wouldn't like to see an Abrams tank turning up outside my house because my arguments for a debt jubilee. We do have, in the current situation, they will take over everything. So if you remember back when Obama was supposed to be our progressive president, there was, as part of the proposal to solve the financial crisis, was an enormous amount of mortgage reset. That never happened. What did happen was that gigantic transfer from what eventually became QE. And just to elaborate on Pavlina to some extent, when QE takes place, that is fundamentally the central bank with an unlimited capacity to do literally unlimited, getting reserves for financial institutions in return for bonds. Now, when they do that with banks, that is just an asset swap, but the bank can't do anything with that money. But when they buy them off non-bank financial institutions, which frankly are owned by the banks, then those non-financial institutions end up with reserves they can't get any investment return out of, so they go and buy shares. So or housing. So in that sense, yes, QE did directly boost house prices through the purchases of bonds off the non-bank financial sector.
So there's lots of great questions here. Here's a provocative one from one of our hosts at the Hannah Arendt Center. If we abolish, this is kind of utopian, begins with a utopian premise in a way. If we abolish taxes and abolish debt, they're both gone, and the government spends to provide welfare and services, don't we experience incredible inflation? Is that sustainable? So that is from Roger Berkowitz.
It's not, of course it's sustainable, because right now you have a choice. Either the banks create credit and charge interest on it, or the government creates credit and spends into the economy. Why is the government money any more inflationary than bank money? The fact is that when the government spends money into the economy, it's usually on infrastructure, on payments to people, and the production and consumption economy. When banks lend money, create money, they create it just like the government prints money, but they create it for people to bid up the price of houses, for people to take over other corporations. They buy to buy assets, not for goods and services. So the government creating this money that banks are creating is actually much less inflationary. It will not increase the cost of housing. It will not increase stocks and bonds. It will just be spent into the economy. The fact that the government creates it as opposed to somebody else doesn't mean a thing.
I'm going to come back to Michael and have a good argument. We haven't had this for a long time, but I'm actually going to point out that one of the problems with this is that if you look at the scale of government spending back before the First World War, it literally was in the American economy, government spending was less than 5% of GDP. Now, if you finance that by spending without taxation, that's not a problem, because you actually want your economy to, before we hit the ecological crisis, which is another question I've seen there, before we hit the ecological limits, you wanted the money supply to be growing by about at least 5% per annum to enable commerce to continue expanding in an expanding economy. But now when you go after the stage of big government, which occurred after the Great Depression and the Second World War, government spending is the order of 30% of GDP. Now, if you injected 30% of GDP every year into the economy with money that does not itself depreciate, then you would have runaway inflation. So the problem actually is not just the creation of money, the need for taxation and so on. It's the thing we actually create allegedly has a value which remains constant and doesn't fall. Now, Keynes praised the monetary theorist Gazelle by saying Gazelle's idea of depreciating money was a very effective idea, that you could create money, and if you didn't use it, it depreciated rapidly. And that was actually used in the town of Wargle during the Great Depression to fight the collapse of the economy caused by the credit system failing. And Wargle ended up having full employment until they were shut down by the Austrian central bank. So it is actually fundamentally the fact that money is set up so that it shouldn't depreciate, when in fact, when you look at it in an ecological sense and a social sense, maybe we should have created a form of money that depreciated on its own. And then you could have had government spending whatever scale was necessary, and the money depreciating over time without needing taxation to cancel its excess creation compared to the scale of economic activity in the economy.
So I want to skip, yeah, go for it. And then
I'll add to this, because I kind of agree with both. Government spending is not inherently inflationary. But government spending without taxation, as Steve Keen is saying, is a very large contribution to the economy, and taxes retrieve some of this purchasing power. But I would go even further. Let's go back to the history of money, that the role of the tax is very important in the launch of units of account and of what you might call, like, the state money. So what is the purpose of the tax? It is the purpose is to transfer resources to the public sector. And so if we abolish that, that has implications for the value of the currency currently, without a doubt, but also it has implications for this transfer of resources from the private to the public domain. And so I'm very willing and happy to entertain ideas of collective provisioning, but clearly the tax serves this function of providing some sort of resource to the public sector, which today we expect that will be then redistributed in a more equitable way. Real resource, not money.
So I want to take us back to the ecological question that came up in the last session in a minute. But first, there's quite a few questions actually here about student debt, which is what we advertised the panel to be about. So I just want to read a couple of them, and I think I might be missing some. Sorry. Nejla asks, how is the National Student Debt Forgiveness Program likely to affect university enrollments? Wouldn't it need to be paired with a future solution such as free college? Is that problematic? I do want to say, and this is partly a David Graeberism, we actually reject the term forgiveness, which implies that the borrower did something wrong. A part of why we try to use words like cancellation, abolition, et cetera. And then this ties another question, if I can find it, related. There's in Dr. Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs, he had proposed universal basic income as a potential solution in reducing the leverage imbalance between workers and employers. Could this be a potential solution to reduce and eliminate student debt? I think there were some others as well, but people want to speak on any of those.
I'll just dive in. If spending for education is one of the classic cases in which the government can spend money into the economy and not have a bureaucrat decide how it gets spent. You give it to the students and say, you spend it. And in that sense, it's almost the perfect means for government money creation, when one of the replies about government money creation is you don't want bureaucrats deciding what to do, you want consumers and you want entrepreneurs. Well, give it to the students. They'll spend, they're the consumers, and it will turn up and the entrepreneurs will try to make gain out of the student spending. And that is a very creative way for government spending to be undertaken. And the travesty, that's one reason I'm delighted not to be in the university sector anymore, the travesty of what student debts did, how students thought about their education, and how a bunch of moronic bureaucratic capitalists took over universities and screwed them up completely. We'd have a far better university sector if it was completely government funded and the entry requirements were not how much money you borrowed, but how many brain cells you had and how well you did in exams and how creative you were. That should be the barrier to getting into universities, and universities should be run by the academic, not run by the bloody bureaucrats and the debt financiers.
There's a simpler way of explaining this point. All over most of the world, education is free. And for most of the world throughout history, education has been free. It's a public utility, just like there's public health. That's free. There's no need to charge a penny for education. China doesn't pay. Other countries have free education. America is unique in charging an enormous amount for education that should be a free public utility.
Yeah.
Where you get there by, as you say, with brains.
Yeah, and this is how I see universal basic income. This is a basic income that is a guaranteed, free access to, what we consider to be the basic essentials of life. What is Social Security? It is an income guarantee because we, as a society, we have decided that we don't want people to be working in their old age. Free public education, free healthcare. I think the idea here is to rethink what the good life is and how we can attain it. The idea that somehow a income grant alone addresses these kind of deep structural questions, I think, I would challenge that. I think that basic income guarantees are essential for many people who are not participating in whatever we call a market economy. But we also want to think about the structural aspects, how we provide this quality of life. I can give you $30,000 a year and you cannot buy health insurance, rent, and all the other things on the market today.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I'm going to actually self-promote here and put a little film in the chat that is called You Are Not Alone that I released earlier this year that has some discussion of what, free public, we really need, if we're going to have a couple student debt cancellation with free public college, we have to make sure that it's abundant, that there aren't also all sorts of, you can have, a public good that isn't offered at the scale that it's needed. And there can be other inequalities that manifest in that. So it kind of gets into some of those deeper questions and problems. The ecology point, Because people raised this in the last Fight Club. I think it's important, how does this all hook into the problem of growth? I mean, I see two ways. One is, debt at interest locks us into a model of endless growth, right? The idea we're going to have more tomorrow than we have today. So we're pushed to exploit planet and people more. But then also when we talk about a debt jubilee, we often go, it'll boost the economy. It'll be great. There'll be growth. I don't know. Is there a contradiction there? How does, we're in an ecological crisis. Let's talk about it. Pavlina, you want to go first? You're on camera.
Yes, sure, happily. I mean, I turn to Graeber again. The concept of the human economy, that everything is premised on care. Our entire existence is premised on care. It's not on an economy. And this economy is a construct. It's a modern construct. But if we kind of really think deeply about the human condition of what we do, even in a capitalist economy on our daily life, what we do is we take care of our children, of ourselves, of our friends, we entertain each other, we feed each other, we educate each other. Like the vast majority of our work is actually care work, but we have just, commodified it in this particular way. So the environment is this kind of crucial dimension because it's existential. We can't quite reproduce a society if we have cannibalized, the very basic resources on which we vitally depend. So for me, it is like a fundamental rethinking of what is work, what the economy is doing, what its purpose is, why do we have even this market, what it is supposed to deliver to us, and if it cannot, why aren't we delivering it in other ways? It's a kind of reimagining. So the climate concern is, I think, the conversation is quite correct. Growth cannot be a measure of success in pretty much anything. And except, like profit returns. And so with respect to these very large existential questions, we need to be thinking about the how-tos and, not just purely technical solutions, but also the social implications of these technical solutions.
I'm going to dive in with my other work, which is actually on climate change and economics. And I have been, if there's one thing that's horrified me more about the thinking of mainstream economists and how they treat money, it's how they've treated the ecology. The stuff which Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize for is garbage that should never have been published. And what's come after that is even worse. The ridiculousness, they are actually talking about a 6-degree increase in temperature causing no more than a 10% fall in GDP. There's a recent paper saying that if we lose every major tipping point on the planet, GDP will be 1.4% lower than if we didn't lose the Amazon, the Gulf Stream, Greenland, the Arctic, West Antarctic. It's ludicrous. It's nonsense. It's garbage. That means we're actually on the cusp of gigantic ecological crisis. And the only way out of it, I'm afraid, in my opinion, is to finance at the monetary side of this. We have to be spending on carbon rather than spending on money. So I'll put a set of proposals together what they call carbon rationing. And if you search for carbonrationing.org, you'll find those ideas developed by a guy called Adam Hardy in the first instance. And the idea there is that we'd have a parallel two price systems. You'd get a universal carbon credit, which you'd have to spend as well as spending money. The universal carbon credit would be given out equally. Rupert Murdoch would get the same carbon credit that Michael Hudson got. But of course, Michael Hudson would never exhaust his carbon credit, whereas Rupert Murdoch could run out in half a minute and have to buy it off Michael. And that would be a form of redistribution of wealth, as well as a way of limiting the damage we do to the carbon we're putting out into the atmosphere.
There is a particular relevance to global warming and pollution to what we're talking about debt. Think of the economy as debt pollution. The debt is growing exponentially, as Steve has shown, and any rate of interest is a doubling time. Think of all this growth of debt, this savings that charges interest that's growing exponentially. This is like carbon into the atmosphere. The models are really very similar. And in both cases, this exponential growth stifles the economy.
And economists are responsible, mainstream economists, that frankly, neoclassical economics has to go. The most dangerous thing for capitalism is not these lefties here talking about debt abolition. It's neoclassical economics avoiding the real issues in capitalism.
Bravo.
Well, I mean, it also ties back into how we began this, which is the public money could do a lot of things, like finance a Green New Deal, right? Like finance a just transition. That I think is also the debt logic, the ideology we're in prevents us from saying, well, hold on, we have the money to finance the transformation we need to make sure everyone's taken care of, right? Like that's kind of the core of it. I want to ask a question here just because I think it's something that we're all hearing about, which is the inflation narrative. This question is one of the first ones we got. As the inflation narrative is increasingly being discussed in the mainstream media as a phenomenon that disproportionately punishes the poor versus the rich, while economic theory recognizes that inflation operates as a transfer of wealth from savers to debtors, what role might inflation play in modern debt jubilee? Or, does this conversation give us any tools to reject the narrative we're hearing about inflation right now?
Again, pardon me jumping in quickly. Inflation can actually be seen as an accidental form of gazillion money. The inflation actually reduces the debt burden. If the money in circulation is falling in value, while if the inflation is occurring, it's actually reducing the real value of debt. And that actually is a lubricating thing for the global economy. And since the debt is mainly owned by 99% of the 1%, I see that inflation actually benefiting up to a certain point, not in hyperinflation, obviously, but benefiting the poor at the expense of the rich. And that's one reason why the rich are so anti-inflation. So I think, and Michael has done plenty of work on that issue as well. So inflation, I would see it as, so when it's below hyperinflation levels, it actually benefits the poor more than the rich.
I mean, I'll step in here. So inflation is one of those other mistheorized macro phenomena by the profession that has been used so effectively to justify all sorts of things. Like we constantly use inflation as not providing enough support for the economy, or to using unemployment to fight inflation. I mean, that is just extraordinary feat of neoclassical economics to say that working people have to be the bulwark against inflation. There's no other phenomena that is supposed to be our defense against, the dark inflation. So it's just that there is just this mythology that we can't achieve both full employment, price stability. Number two, inflation is used to constantly disempower government spending, because the assumption is the government spending is inherently inflationary, which we know it is not correct. The pandemic bears it out. We spend a third of the economy in 1 year, and we see all the inflation coming in from the private sector, from bottlenecks, from supply chains, from logistical problems, from shutting down various sectors in the economy globally. And on top of it, this is very well exploited by firms. We just saw today the Bloomberg article that firms, giant corporations in the United States are posting record profits since the 50s. They're exploiting this kind of partly media-fueled fear of inflation. A customer has resigned themselves that this is inevitable. They're not going to run away from from the firm, but also they're monopsonists. Where are we going to go and buy our stuff when we have this huge concentration of power? And so they are using the pricing power that they have to be able to extract profit margins that are far higher. I think inflation is definitely concerning to people, and that can be a destabilizing social force. And you want to mind, how, what happens to folks' purchasing power, how they perceive this, but there are ways to deal with this that are not, sacrificing growth, employment, well-being, etc. Finally, what if there is inflation? Are we going to let the planet burn? To me, that doesn't even make sense. We cannot wait. We can't structure the right commercial return, or wait for the right inflation, or get the right private interest to do the job. We have public money. We have a crisis. We need to mobilize it immediately, and we need to deal with it. Then we tackle inflation. There are ways, to deal with structure, and I think there are examples of just structurally dealing with inflation around the world. But I'll stop here.
Yeah, there's a really sorry, we're a little all over the place, but that's a live chat here. I think this one is important though. All around the world, rising housing prices are locking out first-time buyers or forcing them to take out enormous mortgages. Will a debt jubilee on mortgages affect housing affordability? And not everyone can take out a mortgage, right? It's forcing a lot of people to be renters, but it is striking that we have historically low mortgage rates. they really went down after the pandemic. And you see mortgage rates of 2.85 or 3%, you sure don't see that on credit cards or payday loans or other kinds of consumer debt. So it feels like there's lots of interesting things to talk about this. And so I'm wondering who feels inspired to take it. And I'm also hearing resonance of Michael's comments about the eviction moratoriums ending. And I think it's just important to underscore that, yes, people have had eviction moratoriums, but that rent has been piling up, right? It wasn't a cancellation of people's rent. So some estimates are saying people owe $50 billion, $70 billion of back rent. There's not, Michael, go for it.
You're muted, Michael. Unmute yourself.
It has to be said.
Yeah, now can you hear me? Okay, this
Yeah.
question came up in the 3rd century BC in Sparta. When, the king decided that the Spartans were so much in debt, he was going to cancel the debts. And one of his relatives, his uncle, actually convinced him, only cancel the mortgage debt. Well, it turns out that canceling the mortgage debts, who had the mortgages? The rich people. If you cancel the mortgage debts, Donald Trump will be the richest man in the country. The most commercial property owners have 1% or 1/10% of their capital. It's all debt. You would be giving the biggest giveaway of wealth in American history to the large commercial mortgage property owners that all of a sudden wouldn't have to pay the banks at all. So the last thing you want to do is to give it away. There is a way around this. You would have to, if you are going to cancel the debts on mortgage, you want to make sure that the government gets all of that rental value that you're just giving away to the absentee owners by a property tax, which is what China's doing. Look at what happened in Russia. Russia could have got back all of the mineral wealth and the housing that Yeltsin gave away simply by taxing away all of the revenue from what it gave away. So if you do cancel the mortgages, you'd have to replace it with a full taxation so that you don't give a free lunch to the most heavily indebted people. The rich own most of the debts. The rich are the biggest debtors. And you don't want to forgive the debts of the rich. You want to forget the debts that people like us owe.
And that's why I've talked in terms of a modern debt jubilee, mate, rather than the old traditional one, because if I modeled this in manifesto, you would have a modern debt jubilee, which would give you $100,000 per person to repay your debts. And therefore Rupert Murdoch would have your debt fall by $100,000 and Pavlina would have a debt fall by $100,000. I think Rupert would note it rather less than Pavlina. So the idea is to do this at an equal level, an equal footing, create the money, use the government's capacity to do that. And therefore it dramatically reduces the debt of the poor. And in fact, the poor could end up being net positive while the rich still have those debts. They don't get out of it. So we have to think intelligently about how to do this. And also, I saw one question there about the housing issue. Getting rid of the mortgage debt alone, with the mortgage debt of the poor rather than the rich, you would still have the capacity for the banking sector to recreate debt and get us back in an asset bubble again. And empirical research and my own modeling shows that what actually causes rising house prices is rising levels of new mortgage debt. So the way to stop that is to say, and this is again, it means a political shift as well to achieve it, is to say that banks can no longer lend as much as they like for a house. They can lend, say, for example, no more than 10 times the annual rental income for a house. Now that would remove the amplifying feedback that currently exists between new mortgages and house prices. Get rid of that, and therefore you get rid of what's actually causing the bubbles in the first place.
That's exactly what happened in 1960s. When I came to New York, that's how things worked. Banks would not lend to anyone where the debt service was more than 25% of their income. And now it's everything's been removed. You're absolutely right. This is how to do it. The three of us are all talking about the economy as a system, not separating debt in one part from another and cutting it apart. We're looking at the overall system, and that's not what neoclassical economics does.
Pavlina, do you have thoughts on this, or should we move on? No. Yeah, I mean, I think just like we talk about a student debt jubilee coupled with free public college, there's a problem with how we approach housing. We have to approach our housing as a speculative asset instead of something that we live in. And so there's all sorts of forms of social housing and other ways to provide for that human need. So as we get towards the end, I want to start asking questions that maybe or even a bit, push the envelope a bit further. So I want to mix two, one from Chad Elson. He asks, how much power are we willing to give to the government to manage our lives by giving it the control of the financial water we swim in? I want to combine that with a question from Nika that I just have to find. Nika, our wonderful co-host, asks, so the capital is power. You say that the state or the palace is obviously better than private creditors. I'm interested in whether a situation with more democratic distribution of power is possible, or in other words, what would a society look like where wealth is not automatically converted to power? So both of these kind of loop us back to some of the original questions about the creditor being the state or the private sector, and add some wrinkles.
I think that's both very good questions, framing one of the strongest arguments people make against government money is that'll let bureaucrats control what happens rather than letting the public, rather than letting private entrepreneurs control what happens in the university sector, and seeing the amount of money wasted by bureaucratic initiatives there. I'm sympathetic to part of that argument. So we do have to consider, how do we stop people who's letting a subset of society control the rest of society. And that again is why things like spending on infrastructure, on education, on health by the government, where the government funds those entirely, removes that issue. You decide how much of your economy should be spent in education, how much should be spent on health. The government provides that money, and then that money goes out through the professionals who decide how it should be spent, and the individuals receive it. They also decide how that money is spent. So we don't have to get caught up in the situation where a bunch of bureaucrats make stupid rules that waste money and so on. And of course, at the same time, we're going to come back and say a lot of very gifted bureaucrats, and we need to get back to the stage where we can see people in the public sector being there for public service reasons. We need to get that ideology back into place, and part of the nonsense Buchanan has given us, where we always regard bureaucrats as bad. But out of that, we've actually had a lot of bad bureaucrats, and we need to reform the government side of things almost as much as the private money system.
So I would answer this to say that it's not so much that the state per se is the issue, but the way the state is governed and captured, right? And so which would be the disempowering narratives that we want to tackle head on? For MMT, it's very clear. Taxes do not pay for government spending. That immediately disempowers the wealthy class. We don't need the taxes of the rich. We don't need them to fund our policy priorities, because we have institutions that are perfectly capable to fund what we desire. And so you see this dichotomy of people supporting, universal healthcare, education, etc., but they are kind of surrendering to this ideology that we can't do this because we need to find the pay for. That is the one gridlock that we see play out over and over and over again across the globe. And we need to remove this tool from the conversation, from people's understanding about money. We do not depend on taxes to fund these public priorities. I also then I'm thinking about various ways in which society organizes itself, right? Because we try together to fill gaps where the state has not contributed, right? If we don't have universal healthcare, we have solidarity economy. If we don't have, and we certainly can't expect that there will be a bureaucrat that can come into my community and say, well, you should do this, this, and this. Like, the community knows, like, their environmental needs, care needs. This is where my own work comes in, that you can actually deploy, you can actually effectively do ground up, support these networks, solidarity networks, endless variety of communities, associations, you name it, that are already doing the kind of care work that we've been talking about, but they are disconnected from this important source of finance, and they're captured in the ideology that they need private credit or some tax from somewhere. So I would actually bring these two to change the paradigm.
Just a footnote to what you said, Pavlina. Nobody has ever said you have to pay as you go when it comes to military spending. Somehow nobody's ever said, where are we going to get the money? They only say it when it comes to spending into the economy that you and I are talking about, the people.
Yeah,
Well, it's good to tax the rich too. They don't have so much money to buy the political influence they have, which, prevents.
Absolutely. This is absolutely. And I think, I would go back to the initial conversation. How high a tax do we need? And the concentration of wealth is so high that taxing income is not going to do the job. Do it 90%. Okay, we've done it before, but it's just not going to disrupt these other processes by which wealth is accumulating. And so we need to think structurally about just removing these opportunities to make money. Like that would be my preference of restructuring the economy. And then, yes, you should tax certain activities out of existence, but I wouldn't even say tax, you just ban, there's certain kind of extraction, maybe, predatory practices, regulatory tools can be used for that.
Well, somebody here asked, are we avoiding the P word for planning? It sounds that this is DT Cochrane. It sounds like we need planning to direct spending investment rather than leaving it to the market. If so, why aren't we saying that? If not, how else do we get where we want and need to go? I guess I would also just underscore another theme here, which has been the way these debt relationships, but again, circumvent or override democratic deliberation and democratic planning, by saying, the bonds, the credit rating agency says this, we can't do that. It's off the table. But what do you think about planning? Michael,
every economy is planned. America is the most centrally planned. We're more centrally planned than China. But the central planning is done by Wall Street, not by the government. Of course, it's centrally planned. The question is, who's going to do the planning? Ever since the Neolithic, you had to plan for the crops, you had to plan to allocate resources. The government has left the planning to the financial sector, and the financial sector lives in the short run. Governments are supposed to live in the long term. So we're talking about short-term people looking at what they can grab in the next 3 months or the year, and what Steve Keen's model and I are talking about are the long term, which is the public point of view.
Pavlina?
Yeah, institutionalists, this is a kind of a starting point for institutionalist economic theory that, planning is always there. The question is who does the planning, in the roaring 20s, the cartels and the trusts, and then it was the corporate sector. We have always had planning. Minsky's work, which is kind of, evolutionary institutionalist financial theory, he argues that there was a short period of time where we had kind of a managerial economy where the public sector took the larger role of public investment, directing public investment, employment. That was right around World War II and soon thereafter. But then we quickly liberalized, and then we had planning by the financial sector, as Michael pointed out. So that I think that it's a dirty word, but I think it's absolutely unavoidable if you just look a little more closely at just the institutional structure and the evolution of the economy. And there are questions we have to ask going forward, how we tackle climate responses. And if our insistence is that we're going to have some private mega corporations through incentives and nudges that they will do the planning, I think we are definitely abdicating our democratic responsibility.
So I want to close this out with a really simple and elegant question. And maybe we can channel David Graeber a bit, who had some, but they ask, would the abolition of debt also abolish borrowing, right? Or are we always borrowing at each other and owing things? Is it something else that's a problem? But yeah, maybe Pavlina, begin with you, and then we'll go to Steve and then Michael, and we'll close out.
I think that the question has certain premise that maybe I'm not super comfortable with, because for me, in a Graebian sense, right, money is connected to debt, but debt is a social obligation, and that's not something that we can kind of cancel and abolish. We have this kind of a sense of reciprocation to one another, and however we trace the history of those relationships, money has been there. And so money to me represents that. I know what I think the question is asking, that we are having this dependence on privately created private debt, and I think that requires restructuring. But can you stop me from giving you a loan? I don't know if that is a possibility. The question is, like, what do we do with that?
I think we've taken the current circumstances we're in of a debt of a ecological crisis coming our way. Then we have to, in that situation, I think we have to fundamentally redefine money. Now, if we think about the question about planning beforehand, largely neoclassical economics and mainstream capitalist ideology said, let the entrepreneurs and let the business people decide how to plan, they'll get it right. Well, if that was true, we wouldn't be facing an ecological crisis. They are short-term thinkers. We do need the long-term, and the government is normally the repository of that long-term thinking. The trouble is, of course, their interests have been captured by the financial class, and that's why we've delayed action on climate change for 50 years. Now, if we have to redefine money in the context of an ecological crisis, then most of the money has to be created in response to our ecological needs. And that's where my idea of a parallel carbon currency and universal carbon credits would be part of that, to limit what we spend, because frankly, we've spent too much. We, as the human society on this planet, takes up far too much of the
Well, regarding debt cancellation,
planet's resources, and that is actually undermining us and destroying our capacities.
oops. Regarding debt cancellation, when I began my Harvard group on the history of debt in the 1990s, the argument by the right-wing archaeologists and anthropologists was you couldn't possibly cancel the debts in Mesopotamia because who would ever lend money? Well, obviously, as soon as they canceled the debts, it all began, as Pavlina said, all began all over again. And so then the right-wingers said, you see, it didn't work. Canceling doesn't work. It begins all over again. Well, of course, it begins all over again. It does work in wiping out the overhead of debt, and then the whole thing will begin all over again until society lets too much debt accumulate. And when too much debt accumulates, then you turn on the debt thermostat and you wipe it out. And that happened again and again with every new ruler in the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, all throughout antiquity. So that's just a false argument that these people not only don't read history, they try to prevent anthropological history from being read or published just because it's ideologically against their right-wing pro-creditor arguments.
Thank you all. We're definitely seeing a war on history these days. So, we know from history that debt cancellation, debt jubilee is possible, but I fully believe we need to build debtor power to get there. So please join the Debt Collective, get organized. Our slogan, one of our many slogans is "You are not alone," LOAN. One thing that does is it isolates us. There's stigma, there's shame. So a first step is overcoming that and banding with others. I'm going to pass the mic to Tara from the Hannah Arendt Center. So thanks all for being here.
On behalf of this Hannah Arendt Center and all of our co-sponsors, Nika and the Museum of Care, Pavlina, and the Economic Democracy Initiative, I want to just thank everybody for this fascinating, excellent, relevant, topical discussion. And Pavlina, Steve, Michael, Astra, thank you for your tremendous moderating. And I hope that you'll stay in contact with our organizations, including Astra's Debt Collective, the Hannah Arendt Center. You can Google us, find us at bar.edu, see more of our events. We have active YouTube channels, and I know, Nika, there are more fight clubs coming up, and it sounds like this conversation is still just getting started. That's my feeling, that we could still keep going. So, and thank you most of all to our audience for staying engaged, posing such great questions, and really pushing this conversation where it needed to go. Okay, everyone. Thank you again. Good night.